We'll go ahead and get started. Good day, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Stakeholder Management in a Crisis. Some things that our presenter has learned about becoming a crisis communicator. This webinar is presented by the ResearchSOC, the National Science Foundation Security Operations Center for Research. You can find out more about the ResearchSOC at researchsoc.iu.edu. I am your host, Todd Stone. Today's presenter is Susan Sons, the Deputy Director of ResearchSOC. With that, let's bring on our presenter. Susan, please take it away.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to start with a short description of what is a crisis communicator. On TV, we're usually called hostage negotiators, but that's definitely not the only thing that we do. Crisis communicators are people who specialize in communicating with people who are under acute stress. So things that we do include talking down potential suicides, calming the panicky parents whose child has just gone missing so that we can get enough information from them to help search for that child, working with survivors of a natural disaster, or talking down hostage takers. We work in all sorts of crises. You might ask, what is a crisis? You may be experiencing one right now. I define a crisis as a stressful, high-impact event for which someone, whoever's affected by the crisis, was unprepared. So COVID-19 really qualifies for a lot of people. There is serious health and economic impact for a lot of different people. A number of people have expressed that they're under stress, and a lot of people, organizations, and governments found that they were unprepared for the realities of this situation. Those are the things that make it a crisis. So as we talk about this, what I'd really like you to do is use the current situation to learn from, because chances are, with everything going on in the world right now, you are very likely to be a responder, a stakeholder, and a bystander all at the same time, depending on which parts of what's going on we're talking about. You may be dealing with new work from home situations, helping people get used to technologies that they're not accustomed to, helping organizations be functional in ways that they're not used to. You may be a stakeholder. You may have things that need to get done. You may have concerns for your family that need to be met, and you want to make sure that those things happen. And in some cases, you're a bystander. There's things that you're watching happen on the news that don't directly affect you and that you cannot directly affect, but you're still there and it's part of your world. So I want you to be thinking about all of these things. I'm going to be using the lens of hostage negotiation to talk about ways to approach crisis communications, but I can pretty much guarantee that everybody on this call is starting to have some experience in this area one way or the other. I'm going to start with my first time. So I am not law enforcement. I have never been law enforcement. I'm a volunteer crisis communicator, and I started completely by accident. My first hostage negotiation was when I was about 14 years old. I was visiting a young woman in my community, a single mom just a little bit older than myself, who I knew from the counseling center where I volunteered. And while I was checking up on her and her new baby, her ex-boyfriend, a low-level gang member, showed up at her apartment to demand that they get back together. You see, a lot of people worry about gang kingpins being suddenly violent, but the ones who get violent without a reason are usually the low-level folks, because they're afraid. They have really tenuous status. They don't know what's going to happen next, and they're afraid that they're in danger when they lose status. And here was a guy who no longer had a pretty girlfriend. When this young woman I was visiting realized she was pregnant, she made a decision that she wasn't going to have anything more to do with bangers and that she was going to live a different kind of life to try to give something better to her child, which was wonderful. But from her ex-boyfriend's perspective, she had robbed him of something, the status that he needed to protect himself and have an income and not become the victim of violence. So he was extremely agitated when he showed up in the apartment, and he began arguing with her, trying to get her back. And when that didn't work, he took her at knife point. I could have left, but I couldn't have taken the baby and left. And the military buddies who later in my life nicknamed me Mama Bear would have told you that I don't do so well when kids are at danger. I can't walk away. It's not in my makeup. So I started talking. I had no illusions that help was on the way. This is not the kind of neighborhood where people call the police. And I knew that if I called the police, my friend would lose the safe home that she'd built for her child because she was in an apartment that was supposed to be a senior complex. It used to be her grandmother's apartment before her grandmother passed away, and she'd be kicked out if they knew that she was living there without anyone elderly. So it was just us. And I kept talking. And I remembered everything that I learned volunteering at a counseling center about de-escalation. How do I get someone to be calmer? How do I get them to be less agitated? It wasn't so much about winning an argument or being right. I just wanted to chill this guy out because he was afraid, and people don't make good decisions when they're afraid. It took about 2 hours, I think. I didn't wear a watch at the time. But ultimately, he realized that someone who only dated him because he held her at knife point probably wasn't going to make him look like the player he wanted to look like. And ultimately, he left. It was a quiet thing. There were no cameras, no police. And we all moved on with our lives. And every time after that, I realized how lucky I'd been to have my first hostage negotiation go with such simplicity. Because the thing about hostage situations is the slower they go, the better they go. Whether you're studying with the crisis negotiation training that the FBI provides, or something that you can get through a trauma psychology center, or I highly recommend Rory Miller's book, Talking Them Through, you will learn that slowing things down helps people waste adrenaline and run out of all of the things that give them nervous energy and makes them agitated. They can take hours or days. That provides a lot of time for stakeholders to come out of the woodwork. And boy, do they ever. I've had police show up and interject themselves in the middle of a hostage situation. I've had the National Guard show up. I've had local mayors and other local officials show up. I've had fire departments show up. I've had the press show up. The owner of the building the hostage situation happened in showed up. I've had the families of the hostages showed up, the families of the hostage taker, random looky-loos who were nearby and saw lights flashing. Some of these people want attention. Some of these people have agendas and expectations. The situation's already on the edge. You see on TV sometimes this idea of, bank robbers or people taking over an embassy because they have a plan. The vast majority of hostage takings are unplanned. According to the FBI, over 99% of hostage takings are because somebody freaked out. Either they became emotionally disturbed, or they were in the middle of committing another crime and something went wrong, and they tried to make a knee-jerk reaction and it didn't work out. Different things happen, but almost never is a hostage situation planned. It is an emotional powder keg. And outside the hostage situation, you may have another emotional powder keg to deal with, because you have police who are trained to get compliance as quickly as they can. I'll talk more about that later. You have press who want to know the story. You have family members who are emotionally invested in the outcome but don't really understand what's going on. And you just have a lot of different players who want to do something, who want to affect the outcome somehow. And I needed a way to manage all of these stakeholders outside the situation while still working the hostage situation itself and being able to maintain some calm, take the time I needed, and work the problem. So here are some observations I'm going to share with you. I spent some time really figuring out what it took to manage stakeholders in these high stress situations. And we can talk about the big picture and every day. I'm specifically talking about what happens during an acute crisis. And I want to be really clear here. This is about getting stakeholders to collaborate and cooperate, not about keeping them happy. Because there are times, especially in a crisis, when you need people to do the right thing, but you're not going to make everyone happy if you do the right thing. It's more important to do the right thing. When somebody's waving a gun at innocent kids, believe me, I care a lot more about getting everyone out alive than I do about making sure that everybody on the outside is happy when it's over. So this is about what people need in order to collaborate. First of all, they need to understand who has a seat at the table and why, because the different stakeholders aren't just focusing on you, they're looking at one another. Whatever their motivations are, if they feel like they might be cut out, they feel like they won't get what they want, or they won't know about the outcome that's coming at them. They also need to know that people at the table won't undercut them and won't cause an outcome that they don't want. If most of your stakeholders are being cooperative and one of them is undercutting the process and causing an undesirable outcome, your other stakeholders are going to be so focused on that disruption that they're not going to be cooperating with you or anyone else or each other. They're going to be reacting to the disruption. And they need confidence that things are moving in the right direction. That doesn't mean that it will be fast. That doesn't mean that it'll be easy. It means that things are improving. In order to create that confidence, they need to understand what's going on. They need to believe that they can reasonably predict what will happen and what can and cannot happen. They need to believe that their goals will be met by collaborating rather than undercutting. And they need to believe that they can manage their stakeholders. When an upset stakeholder calls me or shows up to talk to me, the chances are that they're upset because someone's upset with them. So making sure that making sure that they in turn can manage their stakeholders is one of the most important parts of the process, because otherwise they feel like they're being hung out to dry and they're going to be more focused on managing their situation than on non-interference with my situation. And remember, it's about collaboration and cooperation, not about keeping everyone happy. So I'm going to share a lot of tactics with you throughout this talk, but here's one strategy. And this strategy has served me well through a lot of negotiations and a lot of other types of crises, as far as how to keep all of my stakeholders understanding what's going on and maintain stakeholder confidence. And that is move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. We're going to break it down, but it all comes back to this. Say it over and over to yourself. Move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. I would burn this into my forehead if I was the sort of person who is, I don't know, into forehead tattoos. It is that important. So let's start breaking it down. Move. No matter how slow things go, you need to maintain forward progress, because if people believe that nothing is happening, they start to believe that nothing can happen. And that's one of the ways that you can lose stakeholder confidence. Consistently. Crises are unpredictable. If we were prepared for it, if we knew how it was going to go, if we understood all of the factors at play, it probably wouldn't be a crisis. The person handling the crisis has to provide stability and become a predictable factor. What we do is we start to narrow down the unpredictable things. And it doesn't mean that we know all the answers. It means that we can start to separate things that we know from things that we don't know and help people to understand what's happening and teach them that they can rely on us to have a process and to be able to react to problems. Clearly. I say clearly because what I mean is communication. Communicate more. Panic fills a vacuum in a crisis. If you do not give people information, they will assume something worse than reality. And I don't care how bad reality is, they will find a way to assume something worse. This has been proven to me over and over again. You cannot help people by being unclear or inadequately communicating. And whenever you think you've adequately communicated, you probably need to do it 6 more times, because people miscommunicate at the best of times. People misunderstand, people forget details, but when people are highly stressed, their ability to take in new information and consider it and link it to information they already have is diminished. It's diminished by the adrenaline and the neurotransmitters and all of the stress hormones that are in their systems. It's diminished by fatigue. It's diminished by the thoughts racing through their heads. It's diminished by all of the physiological symptoms of stress, which can include time dilation or time compression, intrusive thoughts. There are so many things that can cause them to miss details. So communicate more, because many of the people, if not all of the people you're communicating with, are under some level of stress. And finally, priorities. Don't just do something, do the right thing, and have a habit of constantly bringing focus, your focus and everyone else's focus, back to what's important. And you have to know what's important, because it is incredibly easy to drift when you constantly have people asking you for things, demanding things, shoving opinions at you. Part of managing stakeholders is understanding what your priorities are, and better yet, if you can share them in advance, and keeping focus on those priorities. So it sounds good, but how do you do it? I'm going to work from the end of this to the beginning. Priorities. Okay, I want you to move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. What's a priority and how do you know where to go? So this is my only priority in a hostage crisis. If no body bags are required, I get a well-prepared steak. I don't always tell people the steak part, but my priority is no body bags are needed, everyone lives. And you would think that this goes without saying, but I actually have to say it over and over and over and point it out to people again, because there are people who were taught that preventing property damage is really, really important. And they don't stop to think about this because they're in a habit of thinking that way. Police are trained to get compliance as quickly as possible and to stop disorder. And so they tend to rush a hostage situation if they haven't been specifically trained for this type of crisis, and that can get people killed. And I tell them, I don't care if it takes a long time. I don't care if they're not complying. What I care about is doing whatever it takes to get everybody out alive. And that's all I care about. And you cannot make me care about anything else. I am a hostage negotiator. I care about us not needing any body bags for this situation. And this has a couple of benefits. First of all, I keep focus on the right thing. I don't worry about whether I like or don't like the hostage taker. I have to be able to empathize with them to some degree to get them to trust me. And, you know, they're probably doing something really bad at the moment. It means that I know what not to worry about. I know what to throw away to focus on the only thing that really matters. It also means I can help other people predict my behavior, because hostage negotiators are really confusing for law enforcement officers, anyone who's tactically trained, and a lot of other authority figures. We behave very differently in how we try to get certain behaviors out of people. And so a big part of my job when I'm working with stakeholders is to help them predict my behavior, which increases stakeholder confidence. No puns there with the steak, by the way. So no body bags are required. That's my priority. And I keep coming back to that, and I repeat it and I repeat it and I repeat it consistently so that people understand that this is the rule and this is not going away. If you ever want a really good book, a fellow named Gary Nosner wrote a book called Stalling for Time. He built the FBI crisis response team and their crisis negotiator training program. And he talks a lot about the FBI's early failed hostage negotiations and how so many of them are attributable to tactical officers not understanding the hostage negotiation process or what the priorities and behavior of hostage negotiators were going to be. So Todd has a poll for you right now. So if you have a moment.
So thank you very much, Susan. That's fascinating. What we'd like to do now, ladies and gentlemen, is to understand kind of your organizational overall cybersecurity priorities. And this is in a general way. And obviously for those that don't apply, don't click, some of you may not have PII or a reputational component, but we're going to give you just about a minute or so. Thank you very much. We really appreciate the participation that's coming in. Looks like almost 3/4 of us have a reputational goal. Over half of us have to protect the confidentiality of PII and at the same time have to protect the integrity of research data. About 20% of us indicated that confidentiality of undisclosed software vulnerabilities is a priority. And over 60% have the availability of systems and data. If you've got some other priority, certainly you can let us know through chat or the QA, but we'll close this in just a couple of seconds. We should be able to see the results of the poll. Susan, can we see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I'll go ahead and close the poll. And Susan, we'll go back to you.
So here's an example of the priorities that we worked out for an information security program in one of the research projects that I worked on. I want you to take a look at this. Your organization's priorities may be different, but one of the cool things about information security is you know who most of your stakeholders are ahead of time. One of the things about walking into a hostage situation is they're pretty darn rare. And so when they happen, I don't know where I'm going to be, in what jurisdiction I'll be, or what stakeholders are going to show up. So I don't get to agree with them on priorities ahead of time. When I'm working with an information security program, it's very, very different. I know who my leadership is. I know who our board is. I know who our funding agency is. We can come up with these priorities ahead of time and put them in our master information security policy. And what that means is we have all agreed about what is most important. And this is an incredibly powerful tool when something happens. Back when I wasn't a CISO, when I was a fairly new member of an information security team on this very project, we had an incident that occurred when basically all of our leadership was on a plane headed to a conference and I couldn't talk to them. And the incident happened and I looked what was going on and I knew that if that attack was left open, we had about a 50-50 chance of having a breach that would endanger the confidentiality of PII, the integrity of our research data, or the confidentiality of undisclosed software vulnerabilities. So I took all of our public-facing systems down for 3 hours. And we fixed it all and we got everything back up, and it was all back up before the plane had landed. But I was able to go to my leadership and say, look, you said that the most important thing here were these 3 items, and down there at number 5 was availability of systems and data, and I took it all down for 3 hours, but I protected priority 1 through 3, and that's what you guys told me was most important. And they said, thank you. If we hadn't had that discussion, even the same people with the same values, in response to a situation where, oh my goodness, a system went down for 3 hours and we looked really bad because our system was down for 3 hours, and I'm sure some of our researchers noticed, may not have felt the same way, because those priorities can feel different when only one of them is at stake in hindsight. And so having those discussions early and testing them with tabletop exercises, take people through a security exercise and say, look, we have a 50% chance that we're going to leak PII, ruin the integrity of our research data, and disclose previously undisclosed software vulnerabilities, your security team wants to take down public-facing systems, and a researcher is complaining because the system's going to be down. What do you do? Make people go through that ahead of time so that they're not trying to make snap judgments under stress, and you will get far more collaborative behavior from everyone when it really comes down to a stressful situation, because they'll already know what they plan to do and what risks they are and aren't okay with. So I have rules for priorities. You don't have to have the same priorities in your organization that I have in my organization. As a matter of fact, even when I'm running the security team for multiple organizations, they tend to have different priorities because they have different missions. That's okay. That's the way it should be. But priorities must follow these 3 rules. You cannot have more priorities than you can remember. Why? Because in an emergency, a 1,000-page binder is not helpful. You need to have actionable information, and what is actionable is things that I can remember in my head and things that fit on my half-letter size cheat sheet next to my computer monitor. That's all you get. So if you have more priorities than you can remember, you need to cut back. You have too many priorities. The next thing is no 2 priorities have the same importance. In an emergency, in a crisis, people have to make choices. Sometimes we can't have everything we want, and if we decide ahead of time what we're willing to sacrifice and when, those decisions in a crisis go much more smoothly. You don't need 15 people's approval to do something, and you're more likely to get high quality decisions because it becomes a decision about the facts of the matter. Instead of arguing about whether reputational loss from having a system go down briefly versus reputational loss from leaking some PII that is probably well known anyway because academics tend to publish their email addresses, instead of having to have that argument in the middle of a security incident, the only argument you have is what is the risk to our PII and how long do we think we really need to take these systems down for? And what are the other consequences of taking them down? That's a very fact-based argument, and you can gather facts and make a decision rapidly and with a high quality of decision making that you can't make when you don't know what your priorities are and not everyone agrees on the priorities. And the last one is priorities are clearly and consistently communicated. If different stakeholders have different ideas about what the priorities are or how they are ranked, what you're going to have is a situation where different stakeholders are applying different pressures to your security team, and a good chief information security officer is going to just decide who to blow off, make a choice and run with it, because even if it's wrong, it's probably better than inaction. And a typical chief information security officer is going to sit there because mom and dad are fighting and try to get them to agree and make a decision before real action is taken. And it can really kill your ability to respond to a real crisis. So by clearly and consistently communicating priorities, it means that if someone has a problem with the list of priorities as they've been decided, that comes up before you're in the middle of an incident. And that is a huge godsend to making incidents go well when you really need to resolve something in a professional and skillful manner. So let's go back to our priority polling. Todd?
Thank you, Susan. We'll launch our second poll, but this one's a little bit different. You've seen these priorities before, but if in a crisis, a cybersecurity crisis at your organization, you had to focus on only one of those goals in a crisis, which one would it be? We'll give you just a few minutes. We'll give you just a little bit of time to respond to this. And thank you very much. The responses are already coming in. This is great stuff. We really appreciate your participation. Just like a horse race, I should say confidentiality is ahead by 2 lengths, but we'll share that in just a moment. Just another few seconds. All right, I'll go ahead and end this poll and I'll share the results. We should be able to see the results. Susan, can you see them?
I can.
Yeah,
and great. It looks like confidentiality of PII won out, And I'm actually kind of impressed that anything beat reputation, because the thing I hear people talking most about at conferences is reputation. So
Well,
you've all made me a little less cynical.
There we go. I'll go ahead and stop sharing the results again. Thank you for your participation. Susan, back to you.
Okay, so we've talked about priorities, and I hope that you will continue talking about priorities with your security teams, with your stakeholders, and with the people in your organization who need to understand what those priorities are so that they can predict your behavior in a crisis. And now we're going to talk about that communication part, because we're going to move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. It's great to have priorities, but if they aren't clear, they're not going to help you very much. Communicate some more. I cannot say this enough. As I've said before, people under stress take in information far less well than they do when they're not under stress. And people who are not under stress often have more going on in their heads than the information that you are trying to give them. My boss, Vaughn, has a wonderful saying. He calls it his rule 7.5. If you say something 7 times, half the people you said it to will think you said it once. He's never actually told me if the other half think you haven't said it yet or know about the other 6 times you said it. I guess that depends on your level of cynicism too. So Todd's going to hit you up with a poll about communication strategy, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the tactics you can use.
So here's a quick poll, ladies and gentlemen. It's something that we in IT and we find other leadership often challenged by. Do we provide lots of information up front, even if we know some of it's going to need to be corrected later, or do we hold on to it until we can be sure of its accuracy? And we'll give you just a few more seconds, maybe 10 seconds or so, to jump in and let us know what you think. Really appreciate the participation. We'll go ahead and end this poll and share the results. Susan, can you see these?
I can.
What do you think?
Well, I think that I'm going to be trying to change some people's minds on this one.
Okay, well, with that, I'll stop sharing the results and please proceed.
So when we communicate, it's okay not to have answers if you haven't communicated a process. So if I don't have answers, if I think that a lot of the information that I think I have now will have to be corrected, or if there are a lot of holes where I don't have information yet, what I do is I tell them the process I'm going to use to get better information and the process I'm going to use to resolve our open questions. This is what I know. This is what I think I found out so far and how much confidence I have in that information. I can't give you an answer on this because I only have 20% of the information I need in to make a judgment. Or we think that this is true, but we only have about a 60% chance of being right. I'm very careful not to give information that I don't believe in unless I can carefully do so with error bars. And I really focus on the process and how we're going to narrow down and eliminate important areas of uncertainty. And the reason that I do that is there's a couple of reasons that I do that. One is all of my stakeholders have stakeholders. And when I put them in a position to say that something's true and have to go back on that, they have a stakeholder management problem. And I don't want to put them in that position. They need to know when information is not reliable enough to pass on to an important stakeholder. I don't want to put them in the pinch of not looking like they're taking care of the situation, because that adds pressure to them, which is more likely to put them in a mode to undercut rather than collaborate. The other thing is the one voice doctrine, clarity and consistency. So what I go for when I'm communicating is, first of all, stakeholders should have one person that they go to for communication. For example, Indiana University has put out a lot of communication about COVID-19 and the things that have happened. But what we don't have is individual board members calling up low-level employees and telling them what's what. We know not to do that because what that does is cause a great deal of confusion. These people operate at very different levels of the organization. They're looking at different things. And the worst case scenario is when you have different high-ranking officials telling someone low-ranking conflicting stories. And that just leads to fear that people can't do the right thing. So what happens is people should be getting very consistent messages from one voice. President McRobbie has been giving out a lot of information, and many of us have been hearing from our departmental VPs or our, if you're in a center or whatever your organizational unit is, that leadership has been giving out some information. But what we don't have is multiple people from the same organization going around saying different things. And because it's so difficult to pass information around in a crisis when everyone's under stress and doing different things, that consistency comes from what I call the one voice doctrine. One person speaks. When we are on a search and rescue run or I'm doing hostage negotiation, if at all possible, someone else on my team deals with the press, and I will never talk to the press at all, or at least not until the incident is over. Simply because it can be very distracting, and because I don't want to have the opportunity to say something conflicting because my mind is elsewhere. If I'm working with a team, it's great because someone else can do stakeholder management entirely while I'm managing the situation. And if not, what I tend to try to do is trim down my stakeholder group as small as possible, and then speak to them all at once and make a regular cadence of when I have to check out and do that, so that they're still only hearing from one person, even if that has to be me. Because what I don't want is to start playing telephone, where I talk to one or two stakeholders and trust them to talk to everyone else, because then different people are getting different versions of the story. And I mentioned earlier that one of the strategies for keeping stakeholder confidence high is that stakeholders need to feel that the person managing the crisis is themselves consistent, that they can understand what to expect from you. And even very small internal inconsistencies from that person can greatly erode stakeholder confidence. So one voice. Whoever it is on your project that speaks during a crisis to outside stakeholders, it needs to be that person. Now, if you're in a position where you have a lot of outside stakeholders, or where, for example, you need to deal with NSF, but somebody in your parent organization, like a press office, has sole dominion over speaking to the press, that's fine. But then it's one voice per stakeholder, and those voices need to internally collaborate very, very closely, because every time you add a voice, you exponentially raise the complexity of that communication. Now, that becomes simpler after the fact when the crisis is over. So also consider that you can achieve the one voice goal by delaying communication. One of the things that I have frequently done in a crisis, especially when I wasn't sure that I should be the one voice, is to tell a stakeholder, you know, here's what I know I'm able to tell you. Here is the date or the time when I can get you more information. And knowing that a report's going to be published next Tuesday, or that, you know, I can have them attend a meeting on Monday or whatever it is, gives them confidence that there's already a process in place and that we just aren't releasing information in the middle of an information security incident. It instills confidence because people know that there's a process and they know they will be communicated with. You don't always have the option to delay communication, but it can be a powerful tool to make sure that you're being consistent in your communication. So about consistency, I'm probably going to hammer on this one more than any one particular section. All four components are important, but consistency is the most important, because when there is a crisis around you, when things are inconsistent, consistency creates trust. And trust is extremely important. Stakeholder confidence comes from predictability. That doesn't mean that You always need to say, here's what I'm going to do, then do it, and never change your mind, even if it's the wrong thing to do. A lot of people are afraid to change direction because they're afraid they'll lose stakeholder confidence. They're afraid to change their minds. What I do is I make myself as predictable to stakeholders while leaving myself room to change my mind. And that comes from, you'll remember when I talked about communication, I talked about laying out a process. And one of the things I do is I explain that there's a lot of discovery still going on, and I reiterate my priorities. I am going to do what it takes to preserve these priorities in this order of importance. And that way people understand my behavior. Even when I slightly change my tactics, they know what the overarching strategy is. And then as discovery comes out, I will share information when I can, when it is appropriate, or in lieu of sharing information, I will let people know when information will be shared so that they know when that's coming. Also, I let people know if I'm going to do something, I let them know the why, because if I have to change tactics, if the why is consistent and I show that I've discovered something new and that it's changed my tactics because I'm going for the same why, that still makes me predictable. They understand why I'm doing what I'm doing. So this is a section from an earlier slide. When I talked about stakeholder confidence, I talked about deciding who's at the table, and we'll assume that you've done this well in advance because that's a nice thing about information security. You generally know who your stakeholders are before the incident hits. So the things that we do to help with stakeholder confidence, make sure they understand what's going on. Make sure they can reasonably predict what will happen. Make sure they feel their goals will be met by collaborating rather than undercutting, and make sure they can manage their stakeholders. When I talk about movement, clarity, consistency, and priorities, consistency touches on all four of these things that your stakeholders need, because they're not going to understand what's going on if you're internally inconsistent and if you're not communicating consistently enough. They will not feel that they can predict the future if you're not consistent. If you just suddenly decide that B is more important than A when A was previously more important than B. They will not believe that their goals will be met by collaborating with you if they don't know what you're going to do next, because you've broken trust. And they don't believe they can manage their stakeholders if they don't believe that they understand what's coming and what they can and can't expect from you well enough to communicate that on to other people. Because remember, we've all played telephone as a child. Whatever message started out at my birthday party, like 24 kids away from me, was not about potatoes dancing in a field, okay? I don't know what it was, but it was not about dancing potatoes. But it's changed as it's passed through different people. There will be a game of telephone going on. So the quality and consistency of how you present the situation is going to impact how much is lost in that game of telephone and how well your stakeholders can manage their stakeholders. So movement. One of the things that we really care about is creating forward motion, because you actually have to solve the crisis. You can't just communicate about it. So I'm going to talk about the 4 kinds of forward motion, and then I'm going to talk about the 2 ways this fails horribly. Discovery, we find and communicate new facts and evidence. Agreement, and I'm not talking about fluffy agreement. Fluffy agreement is when, oh yes, I agree that it's really important that we don't have a data breach. Well, that doesn't really help me, because agreeing with a sense of something and agreeing about what you're willing to set aside or give up to make that happen are very different. So I don't talk about what I call fluffy agreement. I talk about specific commitments. Someone who has committed to take an action. Someone has agreed that facts are true, and we've written them down and we've repeated them enough that if someone was going to argue with them, they're now going to have to disavow something they've said out loud several times and written down. So those kind of things to make agreement very concrete. Action, small steps add up over time. So when I talk about action, I'm talking about activity. We did something. You know, we took down a system, we took a forensic image of it, We re-image the system and we put it back online. Something happened. Impacts. Don't promise what you don't know, but impacts work in two ways. When we talk about impacts, a lot of inexperienced crisis responders are only focused on the impact of the crisis response. What did we fix? How did we help? But the other thing that I talk about as the crisis is ongoing, because early on you don't really know what the outcome's going to be, but what you can, pardon me, what you can talk about is the range of potential impacts. And you can narrow that range over time because we're learning more, we're fixing things, and we're reducing the number of unknowns in the situation. So for example, a long time ago, one of my projects had a security incident that impacted our advertising website. It was on a completely different network at a different organization than any of our main research assets. And, you know, so when I got a frightened call from a stakeholder about it, I was able to say, look, this is an advertising website. We're taking it down to make repairs. Here's the date when I'll be able to give you more information. But in the meantime, I'd like to assure you that none of our research data or PII is at risk, because that's not only on a completely different system, but it's on a completely different network that the system has no access to. It's not even in the same building or the same data center. There are no credentials shared. These systems don't have anything in common. So I was able to bound the impact. So I took what was a very terrifying and open-ended incident for the stakeholder who didn't know much about it when he called me, and reduced the impact in his mind just because I had more information than he did. So those are all ways to show forward motion. Now, this can explode. For those of you who are familiar with the DISC, D-I-S-C communication model, high Ds and high Cs, who tend to be very task and outcome focused, can become obsessed with discovery and impacts. They want to collect all the facts ad nauseum, and they want to get to the outcome, and they do not communicate the steps in between, which makes stakeholders very nervous and shaky because they feel like nothing is happening. So if you are one of the high Ds and high Cs, you need to watch out for that and make sure you don't fall into that failure mode. On the other side, high Is and high S's, folks who are very people-oriented, who are very interested in people being comfortable, tend to fall into the agreement action cycle where they over-focus on getting people to agree and showing that activity is happening, but not necessarily learning something new and not necessarily getting to the impacts. And so it's really important that you're looking at all four of these items and not hyper-focusing on two of them if you want to be really effective in your crisis response and really effective in communicating that response to other people and managing your stakeholders. So tips for maintaining forward motion, a few small tactics. Look for small concrete results on the way to big results. Any win is good. Take the small wins on the way to your big win because they do add up. Do not be a perfectionist. Solving a crisis means being willing to act on incomplete and imperfect information and doing something that's 90% good, because if you wait for the 100% good, something may explode in the meantime. Address your real high priorities and be willing to cut the rest. You just have to decide there are some problems we're not going to solve today. And one voice communication doesn't just protect your message. When one person is out there being that one voice, it means everybody else gets to do the work of dealing with the crisis, and they're not getting interrupted by their superiors, by the press, by somebody who's terrified and tangentially involved in the project. Those people get a new level of focus when they know that no one is coming to them looking for that communication because someone else is the voice. Move consistently and clearly in the direction of your priorities. This has served me very well for a number of years in all sorts of crises, both human and technological, and I hope that it'll serve you as well. So please keep it in mind. Think about what's next for you with your stakeholders as we deal with the current crisis. Think about the ways that our work is changing and the things that will be easy to adapt and difficult to adapt, and think about how you're going to react when something unexpected happens. When that emergent situation comes, what are your real priorities? And I hope there are some things here that you can take with that'll make all of that easier and help you keep your stakeholders on your side while you do what's right for your project and your organization. So that's it, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Susan. Great presentation. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, if you would, please, while we wait for questions. If you do have questions, ladies and gentlemen, you can drop them into the Q&A. And while we wait for those, we would invite you to stay connected with the ResearchSOC. And here's all the different ways you can do that. And we would also invite you to visit our webinars page and consider attending our next webinar, which will be on the 25th of June, Strategies for Better Incident Response. You can, of course, find more information about that on the ResearchSOC website. Here's one question. Will copies of the slides be available in a recording? And yes, we will have those up on the website. It usually takes a couple of days. So we encourage you to enjoy a good long holiday weekend if you're here in the United States, and look for them early next week. We did have another question, and we have a couple of minutes for that. And we find that the question is, Susan, what are the main mistakes that you notice in communications of a current crisis? I'm going to assume we're talking about COVID-19, and what would you do differently? So that's, I'll let you chew on that. And what would you think about that, Susan?
I think there are two that have been bugging me the most just because they're extremely common. One is that when an organization has screwed up, either by releasing information that was incorrect or by making a mistake in how they handled something, they haven't been transparent about it. And two things have happened. First of all, others on the outside who didn't understand what the internal mistake was see them changing their behavior and don't understand why, which means that now their behavior to their stakeholders' perspective is unpredictable. One example of this was when the CDC released a whole bunch of contaminated COVID-19 tests. They didn't tell anyone they had done that, and they didn't recall the tests, but they started discounting some of those test results when they released statistics on COVID-19 infections. And this made a lot of the people trying to analyze the data very confused about why different people who pulled data sets at different times were getting different numbers, and it eroded a lot of trust in the CDC's numbers. Had the CDC just said, we have all these tests we released that were contaminated, and now we're trying to take that out of the data so that we don't have all these invalid tests in our data set, I think it would have eroded trust much less. But unfortunately, the CDC lost a lot of people's trust when they did that. And so I think that lack of transparency when a mistake is made and a direction needs to change is a big one that I'm seeing a lot. Another thing that I'm seeing is people playing the moralism card. In a crisis, there are good choices and there are bad choices. What is a good choice depends a great deal on your priorities, on the facts available to you, and on the confidence you have in those facts. It is one thing to have an objective discussion on what are my priorities, what should our priorities be, what facts do we have, and how much confidence should we have in those facts. Unfortunately, a lot of public discussion has been reduced to, I believe this thing, and here's this nasty way I'm going to characterize everyone who doesn't believe this thing. And when we do that, people's identities get really attached to that specific conclusion because they don't want to be associated with whatever bad thing was said. And that makes people very, very slow to change their opinions and behavior when new information comes to light. And the thing about a crisis is you have to make decisions on limited or only partially reliable information. And when new, better information comes along, you have to be willing to change. And I'm seeing a lot of people who are not willing to change when they find better information than they had before, because they ended up stuck in this good guy, bad guy narrative. And anytime, no matter how bad you think the bad guy is, anytime you let the good guy, bad guy narrative happen, what you're doing is, on a very base psychological level, you are teaching people not to change their minds and for that to be emotionally frightening for them. And we don't want people to be afraid to change their minds in a crisis, because new information is always coming and we need to be able to act on those discoveries. So in Susan's perfect world, if I were allowed to enforce such a thing, organizations would be more transparent, including when they made a mistake. And nobody would descend into moralism and good guy versus bad guy arguments. We would be talking about priorities, information, and our confidence in that information, and talk about decision making that way, so that when the information or the confidence in that information changes, we can change our behavior accordingly to continue to protect our priorities.
Thank you very much, Susan. We do have a couple of other questions out there, but it is 4 o'clock Eastern, so in the interest of time, that is all time we do have today. We want to thank you very much for attending. We want to thank you, Susan, for a great presentation. That was fascinating. And we hope to see you, all of you again, at the next ResearchSOC webinar. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. This concludes our webinar for today.